Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. This is Sam Chase, your host, and with us this evening is Town Manager Paul Cohen. How are you, Paul?
Good, Sam. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been a while since you've been on, and I think what we want to do tonight is we want to focus on the upcoming budget presentation for fiscal 26, and also if we have time left over, we may be able to address some of the issues on the Springtown warrant. But I'd like to get into the budget, and what I'd like to do is introduce it and then let you go from there. I'd like to tell the viewers, and maybe remind some who would remember, that a year ago, right about this time, I think it was actually February 15th of 24, you made a presentation to the Finance Committee, and it was probably the third iteration of your presentations. And what you told us at that time, you said, we're going to be all right for fiscal 25. And even though we have our budgetary challenges, the typical ones, labor agreements coming up, and we were still in the throes of the high inflation and so on and so forth, capital budget needed to be increased. But you said, we're going to be all right because this year we're getting a bump in state aid, roughly 2.4 million, I think it was. 2,487,159 to be exact, and that's going to carry us through. That amounted to about a 15% increase. But you said, you told us a year ago, fiscal 26 is going to be a challenge, and we're going to have a hard time trying to maintain our level services in the face of what we see coming before us. So I would say that the town was warned. You did a very good job of warning the town a year ago that this would be a difficult period. And indeed, we saw the towns around us in fiscal 25 trying to grapple with these concerns at that time because they didn't get an increase in their state aid. And we saw overrides failing in several communities, and in some communities where you might expect an override typically to pass, they didn't. So with that as an introduction, I'll let you speak to the issue about the fiscal 26 budget coming up.
Sure, and I wish I wasn't correct, to be honest.
Well, yes.
but you noted a year ago, we could see it was unfolding. Westford had a failed override, significant budget challenge. They made significant cuts in the schools and the town budget. Drake, it was probably the most notable. They made dramatic cuts, and at the time we could.
And they lost people.
And they lost people.
Yeah.
and basically they've had a pretty significant turnover of their personnel. And at the time we could see that it was a matter of when, not if, it was going to happen to Chelmsford, and it's happening now. And when I talk to my colleagues, either in the Greater Lowell area or around the state, it's a matter of when, not if. It's either they started feeling it last year, as we saw in Drake or Westford, they're feeling it this year like we are in Chelmsford, or they're going to feel it next year. And the simple math is Proposition 2.5 doesn't work when the 2.5% cap doesn't keep pace with inflation. And we've all heard about the inflationary increases in general in society since coming out of the pandemic, the 20% increase in cost over a 5-year period. And so that's what we're affecting now. And the town of Chelmsford receives 3/4 of its revenue for its operating budget from the property tax levy, and that's capped by 2.5%. So what's happening now is, as we prepare for the upcoming fiscal year, that'll start in just under 5 months, we're impacted most significantly in the area of benefits. Our health insurance premiums, the latest information that we have right now is that our premiums are going up by 17.77% over the current year.
So roughly 18%.
Roughly 18%. And the town pays 75% of the premium for its active employees. And that's significant. And then the other one is retirement assessment from Middlesex County Retirement System. They do every 2 years, they do an actuarial evaluation of the town's contribution to the retirement system in terms of its normal cost, i.e. operations, as well as to fund the unfunded liability that has to be paid off in a decade under the state funding schedule. and that increase is 8.4%. And so combined, the increase in health insurance and the pension assessment will utilize 69% of the town's available new revenue for the upcoming fiscal year. That's before you put a penny towards anything else in terms of, labor or cost of operations. And so what's happening to Chelmsford is what's ultimately happening to households and residents in our community. Inflation is having its toll. And in our case, we're a service organization, so it affects us. And we insure 1,000 retirees in terms of, provide benefits for, and about 685 active employees, to the tune of, it's a $13 million budget for health insurance for our active employees. And we're paying, over $12 million for retiree assessment to the, out of a budget that we estimate to be $168.4 million. And so,
and the problem with that is the pool grows, because even if you take the position, we're not going to bring on any new people in our current operations. And maybe even we're going to reduce, which you can speak to that in a minute. But the number of retirees, it seems to me, the number of people getting into the system as retirees versus those that drop out because unfortunately they pass away, that number seems to be getting bigger. Is that a correct?
That's why they do the actuarial evaluation every 2 years, and they do revise mortality charts as well.
Exactly.
And so that affects the exposure there. And unlike the federal government, by law, in Massachusetts, the town, as well as the state, has to have a balanced budget.
We can't print money.
We can't print money. We can't run a deficit. We have natural cost, debt services, fixed cost. And so then basically we have to, fund our operations, because it's given that the people are suffering in terms of the constraints of inflation when they go to the grocery store or get their gas and electricity utility bills and their insurance bills, what have you. We know that we can't turn to them for an additional tax revenue in terms of a form of an operational override. And as you mentioned, it failed in Westford last year. It narrowly passed in a town like Acton, and this year Acton's making cuts because they know they can't ask for one this year. And so that's what's really affecting us, is it's the cost of doing business in this high inflation environment. And we've seen it in capital, just like the homeowners. You shake your head what it costs to replace a vehicle. And obviously, so if we go to replace a vehicle for our rolling stock, whether it's a highway truck or a police sedan, the same costs are affecting us. And not to mention the cost of building projects and so forth. Just like anybody who's pricing what it costs to put an addition on their house or whatever, what it was 5 years ago, it's the same thing. And because we're a municipality, we're subject to prevailing wage law and competitive bidding practices. And so that's really what's affecting us, is we can't maintain the level of services. So at the end of the day, people's taxes are going to go up by the 2.5% allowed increase plus whatever adjustment there is from the change in property values in the community, and they're going to get less services for it. And so that's sad. We're going to be approaching a $9,000 average single-family tax bill, and they're going to get less services. And we literally eliminated positions and basically let people go at the town offices. We had to let 3 people go 2 weeks ago at the town offices, and that's very painful because of the human element. But it's not because those people weren't valued and didn't bring value to the community. It's that when you look at what you have to run as a core government, you basically build the budget from the ground up. And so you have to, as we explained, at the select board, and we'll explain at the finance committee and other levels, in a town meeting, is you basically figure out how do you run your core operations. No matter what we have to do, we have to assess property. Doesn't matter what the market is or what's going on, we still have the same number of properties that we have to professionally assess and then submit to state for approval, because it has to match the market value, as you're well aware. We have to issue property tax bills, sewer bills, collection bills, treasury warrants, payroll. All those things have to function regardless of the town's financial condition. Same thing in accounting. They have to account, for everything that goes through. And then, you have to run a clerk's office and run elections. All those, vital records, all those things have to be provided. They're not fringe elements, and we're at core minimum staffing. So in essence, if you look at the staffing levels of the town government today, of what they were 5 years ago or even 20 years ago, we're at basically essentially level staffing levels.
Very little difference.
And so, because people often have this notion that government is just, has a lot of, fat and largesse and they, can't manage anything. That's not the case. We are basically stretched thin, and we're asking a lot of our employees, and I know that's the same way in private sector too. I get it, but I think sometimes people don't realize that it affects a service organization, and particularly in the schools. The schools have been tough because, we know, and you see the reports, kids still have not caught up academically where they were before the pandemic. You also have an increase in special education demands, as well as tutoring and well as mental health services, and that is unavoidable. That's a cost that has to be met. So we can't cut those programs. And similarly on the police side, many of their calls are mental health related calls. They need assistance there. And we're responding to calls throughout the community, and it's just a very tough situation. So we were left with no alternative other than to build the core of the town and basically, see what's essential and then eliminate what can be, not because it wasn't important, but because it had to be cut. And so that's where we stand right now.
You have to prioritize whenever you go through an exercise like that. And I would also note that the positions, and that's the distinction. Mm-hmm. Well, we're not talking about firing people. We're talking about the elimination of jobs. We're eliminating a position because we have, or you and your staff have decided that that position is not as mission critical maybe as some other position. And that's the kind of process that you have to go through when you make these decisions.
Yeah, and then we pick it up somewhere else. Sometimes we'll apply for grants,
right,
to try to backfill it, or we assign it to someone else.
Right,
so
exactly.
And so that's how you function, and that's what people are doing in their own lives. Is things that valued in their lives that they just can't afford to do anymore.
Correct.
And so I think that's the best way we can try to equate it to folks is, we're seeing the same thing. And the problem is we don't see that this is a correction, that this seems to be a trend, meaning as we sit here a year from now, I'll update that report, and if we look a year from now, it's going to be the same thing. There's nothing that indicates that health insurance, I don't think the increase would be as dramatic as it was this year. And the reason it was so dramatic this year is the estimate this year was obviously too low. So what they do is they look at your claims versus your premiums, like any other insurer does, and our claims are running 100% of our premiums, so therefore they're losing money because you have over administration and other costs that go in addition to claims. So they have to make an adjustment in the rates to make up the loss from this year as well as the projection for next year.
And a lot of it is simply a correction for a declining value dollar because we have inflation. So.
As well as higher utilization of health insurance. I mean,
Correct.
that's the other thing is people are using,
that's right.
They thought when we came out of the pandemic, because people retreated from healthcare, that there'd be a bump and then it would decline, and it didn't. People are utilizing healthcare more, they're using prescription drugs more, and so forth, and the cost of those services, as we know, they're also an industry, it's the largest employer in Massachusetts announced today, that they were laying off employees because they were in fiscal conditions at Mass General Brigham's. And we know about the nursing shortage, and we know about the steward health care, and so we know there's a crisis in healthcare, and it's hitting us in our healthcare because we're a service organization in terms of employment, people who provide services, at education, public safety, and so forth. So that's the big dramatic change, and we have reserves set aside for our union agreements on the school and the town side, and that's because with the tight labor market, if you don't pay people, they're not going to stay anymore. And we've seen that happen. We talked about this at the select board meeting where a police recruit who hadn't even finished his field training after attending the academy for 24 weeks gave his notice and went to another town for more money.
The town made a huge monetary investment in that candidate.
Yeah.
Right.
And we know that we couldn't stop him because it's a non-civil service position. But more importantly, it wasn't the first time we've seen the employee leave.
But would you want to stop him? If he's already made the mental decision to leave.
But it's just emblematic of the time.
Exactly, right.
And I think that's the concern that we had is, we have to pay a competitive wage, and in a time of a shortage of labor, And we've seen this with the actions that we've seen across the state with the teacher strikes and the paraprofessionals and others. People are because of the inflationary environment, are looking, to try to catch up, and that's a struggle. And what we're going to see here is, if the employees are paying 25% of their salary, towards the health insurance premium, 25% of the premium, then that's going to eat into their take home.
Right.
And so you can't fault them. Nobody faults them. It's just the struggle with inflation, which up until the pandemic, we had gone through a prolonged period of low inflation in this country. And,
Correct.
and I think the hope was, and it probably was what spun the election in large part, was that we could return to that state. But it hasn't happened yet. And there's no indication that it's going to go back to that level.
I read a couple of days ago, and again, it's just what I read. I don't know if it's true or not, but the statement was that if we went back to the fiscal year 2019 federal budget with the amount of revenue that's coming in today, the budget would be balanced.
Yeah.
So we're talking a 6-year variation.
Mm-hmm.
And most of that is inflationary. We've had a reduction in the value of the purchasing power of the dollar, and as you say, everybody is feeling that. And the town, you might even argue that the town is in a worse position because of all of the statutory requirements that are placed on the town for the way we have to run our business. You don't have the ability, like a person in the private sector or even managing his own home, to you don't have as many options that you can pick from, is what I'm saying. So
I can't raise prices. Right?
Exactly right.
Unlike a plumber, an electrician,
Right.
or a supermarket, you just can't pass on the cost like they do for eggs today, for example, and say it. We're constrained by 2.5 regardless of the inflation.
Plus it's not a competitive market. I mean, I can't, if I want police services, there's only one place I can go, and that's to you, right? So that's, it's not quite the same, but
And we don't have a backdoor like the state did.
Right.
The state's budget is growing by 2.2% technically, but yet the state has the backdoor of the millionaire's tax or the fair share tax. So, as many are noting, their budget is actually growing by over 7% because they're utilizing those dollars to provide core services, including Chapter 70 education funding in the governor's proposed budget. So that's what the constraint is here. And then many of us at the local municipal level are kind of concerned, to be a polite word, with the state because they're providing a number of services that they weren't providing prior to the pandemic, like free lunch for students in schools, free community college. And all those things have merit and they have value, but yet we feel they're not able to provide the core Chapter 70 and educational funding for the cities and towns that are needed to maintain the cost for those services. And in fact, that story made the front page of the Globe. Basically, and so that's what, I think that's the tension in the municipal level, is our partner at the state is kind of leaving us a little bit behind because they have other priorities. Meaning these, and again, notable priorities. It's not, and so what we've done is we focus on the core, but yet somehow we feel the state is redefining its core and kind of leaving the cities and towns. So, for example, our state aid is only 2.2% for our general unrestricted government aid, and then our Chapter 70 aid, it comes out to 2.4%. And that's not going to cut it. It just in the demand for services and the cost of services that's running. And so that's the budget story in a nutshell. It's not a complicated tale. It's just the fiscal realities of services.
What can we provide with the dollars that are available?
Right.
Really is what it boils down to. And
it pains us, and part of it is we don't like to close the library on Sundays as we're proposing the budget, or not to have lifeguards at the beaches, or to do less as an entity, but we have to be fiscally responsible, and so we have no choice, and that's how we faced it. Is what we literally met with every department head and said, how can you help out? And then we took their suggestions and made the painful decisions.
And that is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
Because those decisions should not be made 100% top down without any input from the departments that are going to be affected. And so that's absolutely.
And we try to maintain the core. Like, we're not closing fire stations. We're not cutting patrol officers on the street. So we're trying to maintain the core of what people value in the community, and we always have stated those priorities: education, public safety, public health. The problem that I see going forward is, where do we go from here? Because if we've now at the minimum core level in the town office building, then there isn't a lot more to go, and that's why looking ahead is so critical, because it's, again, what do we value as a community?
I don't. I try not to be pessimistic, but I agree with you. I mean, things are going on at the national level now that people we've never experienced before, and it seems to that the mantra seems to be, well, we're trying to get the cost of government down, and if there's any success in that, that tells me that all else being equal, that should be a moderating factor on inflation. But I'm not convinced. And if it does happen, it's not going to happen within the next 12 months. That's an ongoing process, and I'm not convinced that we're going to see some of the results that have been claimed that we're going to receive.
Well, I think the scary part is how much the state and the local governments are dependent on federal funding.
And that's the problem.
That's the problem.
Because, the fact of the matter is that whatever your political philosophy is, the federal government has grown at exponential levels, and they have taken money out of the private economy, and it's a redistributive thing. And like you say, state and local governments and other people in the country have become dependent on these programs. Some of programs may not have even existed 10, 15, 20 years ago. And to stop that or to mitigate it, it's like somebody being a drug addict. Now all of a sudden you're taking the drug away from them. It's going to be very, very painful.
Particularly in the case of healthcare. Right. The biggest industry in Massachusetts is healthcare based.
Yep.
The largest employer, as I said, is General Brigham's is the largest employer in the state. And so it is amazing that you don't hearing a lot about healthcare reform in the state. No. Like, how are we going to deal with the cost of healthcare, or even at the federal level? It's striking that that's not priority number one. It's inflation is priority number one, but one of the big drivers again is healthcare. And
if you're seeking to cut costs, you have to go where the money is.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where it's going to be over $30,000 for an HMO premium, and the town's paying $25,000 of that. And so the question becomes, at what point does it just, is it not sustainable to do?
Whatever you pay your employee in the salary, add another $25,000.
Just for the health.
Just for the health. Never mind the other benefits.
That's right.
Right. Yeah.
And so
that's a sobering statistic.
Yeah, it really is. If you're hiring a $50,000 a year employee,
it's really an $85,000 or a $90,000 a year employee when you wrap all of the benefits together. Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. That tells me you have to be very careful in your hiring decisions.
Yeah.
And no, I've looked at the Chelmsford municipal government for years, and comparing it to the towns around us, and we certainly are not overstaffed, not by any stretch of the imagination.
And so I mentioned the positions that we had to let 3 people go, but we stopped filling positions some time ago. So when we looked at the number of positions, that's what I said. If you looked at where we were, we could see this coming, and therefore in the last year and a half, 2 years, I didn't fill positions because I didn't want to fill a position and then let the person go, because the town's on a pay-as-you-go unemployment system. So it's not like a payroll tax. We actually pay upon our claims.
Yep.
So that would be very costly for 26 plus weeks to pay somebody who we let go. So that's So I don't want to keep beating the drum on this, but that's the big driver is we're just hamstrung by the cost of doing operations because the nature of the work hasn't changed, right? School, they have the technology in the schools, they have the equipment for the, in public safety and so forth. It's just the cost of it. I mean, to buy a fire engine today is close to $1 million.
Imagine that.
It's almost 50% greater than it was 5 years ago, and the ladder truck is approaching $1.8 million. When before the ladder truck was always $1 million purchase or $1.2 million, and it's just gotten out of control. And this, and the problem is there aren't many providers. And if there's one thing that bothers me that I think has been lost at the state and even and particularly the federal level is the antitrust, or the competitive nature aspect. You've heard about it. The school committee goes out for a bus contract for school buses, one bidder.
Right.
How is that competitive? And then when they look and they see a holding company owns the region, and the same thing with fire apparatus. Nationally, there's only there's holding companies. There's only a few independent fire. That's not how it was 10 years ago.
No.
But nobody did anything about it. And it all goes back to this idea of capital and venture capital and holding companies, and and so I think that's the most basic economics, right? Competitiveness, supply and demand.
We are now at the
Yeah.
at the end of the line, because like you say, when we were in college and we studied economics, you talked about the fledgling economy, the middling economy, and the mature economy, and that's what we're at, the super mature economy, where everything is concentrated and you don't get the competitiveness.
Because we were told we had to be bigger to compete globally.
Correct.
So what that did is it concentrated the markets in the U.S. so you don't have competition at home. You go to buy an automobile, there's still a handful of manufacturers, but it's not what it was,
the number of
vehicles and makes and models that it was before. And bring it to any industry, technology, what have you.
And the consumer is going to go for the lowest price.
Right, exactly.
Always.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why you see chains and you don't see the independent operators anymore, because the independent pharmacies being the perfect example, right? Used to be a neighborhood pharmacy. Now it's CVS, Walgreens, but the neighborhood one's gone. And so it tends to draw money out of the local economy, but second of all, the competition isn't there.
Well, to paraphrase Harry Truman, he said at one point on the floor of the Senate, he said, the country is 10,000 times better off with 10,000 corner hardware stores than we are with one Home Depot. He didn't say Home Depot.
Right. But
whatever the equivalent was back when he was making that speech. And that's exactly right. And that's the problem. We don't have the choices. It's a huge problem. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Because you can't force people to start companies.
No. No.
So I don't
and that's the other issue is the lending cost, borrowing cost is really constraining.
Yeah.
So again, we have to deal with the cards that were dealt, the reality that
Exactly.
we're here with. We balanced the budget. It didn't make everybody happy. Not everybody agrees, but we have a plan that at least keeps us functioning. Again, with the loss of legitimate services valued, operations moving forward.
And I've taken just a very cursory look at the school budget, preliminary that Dr. Lang has put out, and they've gone through the same exercise. I see that they've made adjustments and some reductions and so forth. So I mean,
Yeah, and what we didn't do is we didn't sort of take shortcuts that would be long-term consequences. We didn't cut our capital funding. $168 million operating budget, we got $6 million for capital. So we didn't, first of all, you wouldn't save much because it's amortized over a 10 or 15 year schedule, but we didn't play games like, well, let's ignore the infrastructure, or let's draw on cash reserves, that kind of thing. That just sets you up for a cliff. And so that's really...
Well, that was standard operating procedure until you took over, okay? Because that's what the town did regularly. We did deferred maintenance and all that other nonsense, right?
And it's easy to do, but it's long-term costly. It's no different than if, same thing, I try to relate to the homeowner. Yeah, you cannot fix the roof of your house and not take care of your boiler, but eventually it's going to come home and it's going to cost you more.
Much more.
It was like the old commercial, right? You can pay me now or pay me later.
The oil filter.
The oil filter, right? Yeah, yeah, right. That's what you've got to do for an oil filter. You've got to pay now or pay later, and it's actually better to stay ahead of it. So again, we've tried to be responsible, and I think that's the one thing that saddens me in the big picture, Sam, is what are we leaving for the generation or two after us? The federal deficit is appalling. And it's shameful for everyone. And I wish somebody would talk about that. In terms of, everyone bemoans the cuts and the waste in the federal government, whatever they want to talk about, but no one wants to go to the core issue: is the budget, federal budget's not balanced. We're leaving a tremendous debt for our next generation.
Well, we'll have to.
Here at the local level, we're paying $11 million for unfunded pension obligation out of our operating budget that we could surely lose today.
Well, we'll have to have that conversation because we're out of time now.